So we began our Easter celebration where the story always begins, at the empty tomb. And though each of the Gospels contain different details in retelling the story of how those early disciples discovered that the tomb was empty, all of the eyewitness accounts end on the same note: disbelief. Disciples failing to trust what they saw with their very own eyes and what they heard with their very own ears. As Luke reported, the women, after discovering the tomb empty, do as the angel tells them to do. They told the 11 and the others. And notice Luke makes the point of saying the 11, emphasizing the break in the intimate communion they had all shared together with Jesus, severed by Judas's betrayal. When the women tell the 11 and all the unidentified others the good news they had received that Jesus is alive, their words are dismissed as utter nonsense. So Peter, always being the first disciple to want to know everything, runs to the tomb to see for himself. He looks in, he sees the tomb empty, and yet he goes home. And he goes home to wonder what has possibly happened. That the tomb was empty isn't the sign of the resurrection. So the disciples remain hidden in fear, locked behind closed doors in that upper room, while all the others go home, also wondering what happened. Not just what happened to Jesus's body, but how could they begin to comprehend all the events that had taken place? From the high of a hero's welcome to the agonizing death on a wooden cross. Their hearts filled with grief over the death of their beloved teacher and friend. How would they go on living without him? And how would they live with their own guilt and shame that they didn't remain faithful to him all the way to the end? Ashamed that only his mother and a couple of women and his best friend John stayed by his side as he was tortured, humiliated, and crucified. Two of them begin their journey home, processing it all out loud as they walked. And as we know, when it comes to storytelling in the Gospels, there are no minor details. Those facts that were ultimately recorded for posterity bear the weight of revelation. And Luke tells us that these two followers of Jesus were going to Emmaus. And that little word "to" means we're walking away from Jerusalem. And he also tells us that the Sabbath was over. And since Emmaus is west of Jerusalem, these two followers of Jesus were walking away from Jerusalem into the setting sun, the light of day fading into the darkness of night. It's such a vivid image of the condition of their hearts as they left the city of God behind them, the place where God promised to restore the throne of David and the kingdom of Israel. brokenhearted, despairing in spirit. They're walking away from the city of hope, the city of promise. And without warning, and seemingly out of thin air, a stranger walks beside them. He wants to know what they're talking about, which catches them off guard as they can't imagine how anyone who had been in Jerusalem hadn't heard that the Romans had unjustly convicted an innocent rabbi of treason and had crucified him alongside two common thieves. But this man appeared sincere in his ignorance, so they tell him. And out pours a tale of shattered hopes and dreams. This man, Jesus, who they knew to be a prophet, who had healed the sick, who had welcomed the outcast, who forgave people their grievous sins, who taught the word in ways they could understand and appropriate for their lives. This man, Jesus, they had hoped was more than a prophet, mighty in word and deed, but apparently he wasn't. They had hoped that he was the promised Messiah, but apparently they were mistaken. They had hoped. Words of despair, discouragement, and grave disappointment. All their hopes and dreams shattered. They decided to go home to life as it had been before they had left everything behind to follow this promising young upstart of a rabbi. And we can all picture it. Their heads down, their eyes fixed on the road before them as darkness increases, making it harder and harder for them to see too far ahead of them. And then comes the encounter. Jesus walks up alongside them. He hears the hopelessness in their voices. So he asks them a question. Have you not been paying attention? Have you not really understood all that God has been trying to reveal to you? Since the time of Moses until now? And we can only imagine them staring at Jesus in this sort of, what do you mean look? And so Jesus tells them God's story, a story of God's persistent and passionate desire to be in a loving, covenantal relationship with all of God's people. How God sent prophet after prophet to call God's beloved children into that relationship. For 7 whole miles, this strange teacher seems to know more than they knew about the promised Messiah. So when they get home, they want to hear more. They invite him in and ask him to stay, to dine with them. And in a rather audacious gesture, this stranger places himself as host at the table. And then he assumes the host honor by blessing the bread, leaving everyone mystified until he breaks it. Now they remember. They have seen these loving hands before. That day, 5,000 or more people were fed as he blessed and broke and gave them bread to eat. And suddenly their eyes were opened. And that phrase literally describes how the firstborn child opens a womb. Their sudden realization that the risen Lord was standing right before their very eyes was the dawning of the new creation. The new creation that comes and will come and is coming as the resurrection power of God is unleashed upon the world by those who are willing to receive it. And they say, were our hearts not burning? No. Because they were filled with discouragement, filled with hopelessness, sorrow, grief, and despair. Jesus' words weren't enough. They desperately needed a sign that he had indeed been risen. Because that empty tomb wasn't a sign of anything. Only the breaking of the bread and the word proclaimed are signs that the risen Jesus is alive and amongst us. From that day of resurrection to today, our risen Lord appears whenever, wherever, and however he is wanting to encounter us. But always when we keep the feast of new life with him, not just at this table when we celebrate the sacrament, but when we daily keep that feast in our hearts, filled to overflowing with resurrection hope. Those witnesses to the resurrection run 7 miles back to Jerusalem because they can't wait to tell the disciples, Jesus is risen, he is risen indeed. And it is the good news every one of us has to share. Because of our own times when the light of life has faded into the darkness of grief, of sorrow, of despair, of hopelessness. And we are desperately in need of hope and promise. And then somehow, mysteriously, our risen Lord appears in our midst. When we are at our lowest, when we are least expecting it. And then we receive again the resurrection power of our God, who sent us the one to save us, who sent us the one to bring us an abundant life, who, as he said at that Last Supper, that our joy might be made full. In the space between us, our risen Lord is present among us. Let us keep the feast of new life. Amen.